some, I don't want to be too, I started this out the wrong way. Let me go back. I won't tell you how many years ago I met her, but actually she did not know that our lives would cross again. And neither did I, because we were both at the same high school in New York City. She was older than me. That means she's still older than me. And she was the president of the student body. And this was I mentioned it yesterday, Julia Richmond High School. Now, you know, this is a New York City public high school, and this high school had about 3,000 students. I know that when I graduated, my class was 724. I know that it was 724 because at the graduation, I was the last person online. And I probably know, I do know that she was also the last person online when she graduated. And that's because I was the president of the student organization in my senior year at Julia Richmond High School. And the person who I who I came after? It's that New York, I can't get my tongue around it. But the previous year, she had been the president of the GO, and her name is Elizabeth Higginbotham. All right, so fast forward about 30 years by this time? No, maybe not that long, maybe 20, 25 years or so. And we're at the Organization of American Historians. Meanwhile, I had been getting this flyer from Memphis. It was Memphis State? Yeah, Memphis State. And it was from this women's consortium. And I'm looking at this name and I'm saying, I wonder if that's the same Elizabeth Higginbotham that used to be the president of the GO, General Organization, at Julia Richmond High School. We happened to be at the Organization of American Historians at one meeting and sitting at the same table, and I said, "Did you go to Julia Richmond High School?" And she said, "Yeah." And it turns out that, yes, she is the same Elizabeth Higginbotham who went to Julia Richmond High School and graduated back in the 1960s, and who I succeeded as the president of the GO. So I'm just mentioning that as a way to say, you know, that's really cool. Today, she is the associate professor in, I got the wrong, I'm sorry. Okay, I was reading the wrong person's, I was reading the wrong bio. All right. She is a full professor, yes, at the University of Delaware in the Department of Sociology, and she's been there since 1998. And she was previously at the University of Memphis, where she worked to build the Center for Research on Women. She has conducted research and faculty development through that project. Her book is Too Much to Ask, Black Women in the Era of Integration. And she's also, she's published many articles on Black women. Elizabeth Higginbotham, former president of the Julia Richmond General Organization.
I know when I met Deborah at the OAH, it was like, I'd seen this name, Deborah Gray White, and when I met her, I said, Deborah Gray, I can't believe it. It's a small world. I want to join the chorus in thanking Deborah, Marcia, and Marcia for this wonderful, wonderful occasion. And let me put this down. Like many, 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 many people, this is glorious. And we need to do this more and more often in different venues and different sizes, but it's important to really remain connected. But I also really want to thank Deborah, who walked out of the room, for telling stories. Like many black women academics, I was very excited about telling stories, especially putting down on paper the work involved in creating scholarship that seeks to unravel many of the myths put into place to support our oppression. It is rewarding to labor to reveal the resiliency, the courage, and the thinking of black women that has been obscured by these myths. But it is labor, and there are obstacles. Fewer for many of the younger cohort, since pioneers have opened many doors. Yet, I can see the mixed bag of timing. As those of us who I see as pioneers did enjoy some advantages. However, as sociologists, we face similar challenges to the historians writing in telling stories. I focus here on reframing because it seems to me that since I stepped into this profession, black women sociologists have been dispelling myths about black women, only to have new ones emerge. Myth busting seems to be always on the research agenda. As I read historical material, I learned that beginning early in the last century, black women and men in the social sciences have also been doing this work. My own article in Some of Us Are Brave was about challenging myths. And I should say that while I wrote that article that gets excerpted in that book in 1979, because it took Barbara Smith years to find a publisher. And sometimes I think that I will continue over the rest of my career to be challenging myths. Since early in the last century, the social sciences defined black women as a social problem. We just find the type of social problem black women seem to be always changing. But the way that black women are framed supports a system of oppression. Often in this very competitive work, we get locked into narrow debates, yet myth battling is critical work since these stereotypes are the rationale for keeping doors closed and limiting social support not only for black women, but for families and communities. I had this theme in mind when I put together this panel. Deborah asked me at the OAH to organize it, and I was delighted. I wanted Cora Merritt to join us, since she has a unique perspective. Dr. Merritt has not only been involved in teaching and administration in higher education, but she has labored in various positions in government and nonprofit organizations that provide funding for scholars. I knew Dr. Merritt because she's a sociologist and was at University of Wisconsin, but I saw her at the first Ford Foundation Postdoctoral Fellowship Conference that I think was in 1983 or 1984. And it was surprising to see her there because she was not a Ford postdoc. But I said, "What are you doing here?" And she said, "I told Ford they needed to do this." It's very important, just as Janine was saying, to have people in places that can do that institutional transformation that is so important to changing the conditions under which we work. Fortunately, Barack Obama was elected president, and this has created a great deal of work at the National Science Foundation, which is where Cora Merritt works. Therefore, she was not able to join us, but I think we could appreciate having people at the National Science Foundation who take the social sciences seriously, including attention to race, gender, and social class. Perhaps we all know from our lives that we have some advantages and privileges as educated women who get to work in higher education. For many of us, the tower is not ivory. Black women working in higher education are overrepresented in community colleges and teaching institutions where they share offices and work long hours. I see myself as relatively privileged because I was well supported as a graduate student, thanks not only to Brandeis, but to the Ford Foundation and the American Sociological Association. So I was well supported. I emerged with a doctoral degree without a mountain of debt. I've also been at major research universities and have had visiting appointments with perks, even when I didn't get them at my own home institutions. However, I know that life for me ain't been no crystal stair. There are tacks and splinters that took the form of treatment that was centered on doubts about my abilities and the continuing questioning of my expertise. I want to say that when I started at Brandeis in 1971, I was one of 2 raised working class students in my cohort. And class, as well as race and gender, were critical issues. People at that institution expected me to get my PhD, but not really impact the field. So the boards were there, but as I reached the academy, I could see places where the carpet was missing. Without mentors and a legacy in higher education, I had to develop my own map to sort out how to survive, and in particular, find my own voice. I was lucky because there was a tiny cohort ahead of me and many old-timers who offered advice and support. However, these scholars were not people at my own institution. When I arrived at the University of Pittsburgh, I was the black woman sociologist in Allegheny County. I did reach out where I could and develop supportive relationships with other colleagues of color. Most of us knew from graduate school. We did not have the tools to support each other around our scholarship because we were all token scholars in a range of departments that spread across the sciences, arts and humanities, social science, and business. We did form a community that sustained us. Some of my best friends were people from those days. It was only at arriving at the University of Memphis, well, it was Memphis State at the time, but coming there in 1983 to join with Bonnie Thornton-Dill and Lynn Weber in developing the Center for Research on Women, that it was a sea change. I had the opportunity to work with colleagues in the social sciences who had a similar agenda of change, especially taking race, gender, and class seriously. However, there has been darkness as we struggle to get grants to actually do research grounded in our understanding of social issues. We stood our ground to get money to foster education and faculty development projects that we painfully saw the need for since we had come through graduate school mentoring ourselves. Yet grant officers had traditional ways of thinking about projects. Sometimes it seemed as if there was no light as we worked in tunnels without any sense that there was going to be any deliverance at the end of all our toil. Yet light did come, and securing funding was a relief because it meant we had the opportunity to do innovative work we saw as important. There's no smooth sailing as you turn corners and find other obstacles, like our struggles with gatekeeping journals where reviewers failed to grasp our point of view. We faced opposition as we challenged mainstream thinking about black women and their situations. After many requests for revise and resubmits, we still found our work rejected because reviewers did not understand how we wanted to frame our investigations. While we found venues to voice our work in so-called lesser journals and collections where we joined with others to get the word out, these were not publications that our institutions really saw as worthy of granting tenure and promotions. Through all these encounters, I've had the strength of colleagues, sisters and brothers of various hues, we have made strides and had impacted the field. However, as I think back over the career and the various stages, I think the best move we ever made was bringing together the faculty in the Summer Institutes of 1983 and 1986. Our curriculum integration seminars were also important, and people here have commented about their role in their own lives. Our Summer Institutes were dynamic settings for the participants, but they were life-changing for the faculty. Coming together to teach others about scholarship that we valued interrupted the isolation that many women of color faced as tokens in their own institutions at a time when few established scholars valued their work. We connected with each other as we read, commented, and assisted our individual developments. We have to really think about historical trends here. As I sit here and listen, I think it's great to see young people turn their dissertations into books. I published my dissertation, much revised, when I was a full professor. And I want to say that that was really because of Nell Painter. When I came out, there was no interest in the work on black women. There was no market for such publications. And while I went on to do other things, it was really very important that pioneers move into positions where they are editing series for presses that make opportunities available. But I think coming together and working with other, at that time, isolated women of color really is important. Collectively, that scholarship that the pioneers produced has been able to impact the field and create new spaces for others to follow. Hopefully here at this conference we can do some of that coming together, remaining connected, building supportive relationships that will enhance individual careers, but also continue to change the fields that have misrepresented our lives. And I think big conferences are important, but also working groups. You know, small as well as large venues are critical. So that was how I framed this. And on this panel with me is Camille Charles, down at the end, who earned her PhD in 1996 from the University of California, Los Angeles, where she worked with Melvin Oliver, Larry Bobo, Walter Allen. So she's another one of these second generation. Her research interests are in the area of urban inequality, racial attitudes, intergroup relations, racial residential segregation, minorities in higher education, and racial identity. Camille is the Edmund J. and Louise W. Kahn Term Professor in the Social Sciences in the Department of Sociology at the University of Pennsylvania. She's also the incoming director of the Center for Africana Studies. She's the author of Won't You Be My Neighbor? Race, Class, and Residence in Los Angeles, which explores, great title, you always need that sexy title, which explores both race and class-based explanations for persistent residential segregation by race. She's also co-author of The Source of the River, The Social Origins of Freshmen in American Selective Colleges and Universities. Most recently, she's co-author of Taming the River, Negotiating the Academic, Financial, and Social Currents in Selective Colleges and Universities. Those are both Princeton University Press books. She's on sabbatical, and she's also nearing completion of a sole-authored book on black racial identity in the United States, tentatively titled The New Black, Race Conscious or Post-Racial. We will also be hearing from my long-term friend and former colleague, Bonnie Thornton-Dill. She is currently the professor and chair of the Department of Women's Studies and founding director of the Consortium of Race, Gender, and Ethnicity at the University of Maryland. She is formerly the founding director of the Center for Research on Women at the University of Memphis. Her research focuses on the intersections of race, class, and gender with an emphasis on African American women and families. Dr. Dill's scholarship has been reprinted in numerous collections and edited volumes, and recently she's just completed with Ruth Zambrana, Emerging Intersections, Race, Class, and Gender in Theory, Policy, and Practice, which I think there's still a few copies on sale out in the lobby. Because of her innovative work, Dr. Dill has a number of prestigious awards, including 2 awards for mentoring, one from the Sociologists for Women in Society and a second from the University System of Maryland Regents. She also received the Jessie Bernard Award and the Distinguished Contribution of Teaching Award from the American Sociological Association, which we got for the work at the Center for Research on Women. She's been the Eastern Sociological Society's Robin M. Williams Distinguished Lecturer. She was elected and served as Vice President of the American Sociological Association. And this, beginning in September of 2009, she will begin a 1-year appointment as the Stanley Kelly Jr. Visiting Professor for Distinguished Teaching in the Department of Sociology at Princeton University. This is our panel. So I'm going to talk about reframing and then turn over the podium to them. And hopefully you will find this interesting. Because I think framing and reframing is very important and often gets in the way of our work. I was watching the 2005 Academy Awards when George Clooney, who got an Oscar, applauded the liberalism of Hollywood, where they gave Hattie McDaniels an award in 1939, an Oscar in 1939, when many black people were still riding the bus. In the year after Hattie McDaniel earned her Oscar for Gone with the Wind, the U.S. Census reported that 59.9% of employed black women were private household workers, many of them taking the bus to work. Yet, I was ready to scream when Clooney made this statement, because it not only reflects the limits of liberalism, but the representation of black women who Hattie McDaniel portrayed in film was part of a structure of oppression, just as the laws that supported segregation in the South. Working in Hollywood made Hattie McDaniels rich, and she was clearly not a servant at home, but her celluloid image as a servant supported and normalized that role for black women. Hollywood gave us the master narrative about the domestic worker. She's a black woman who loves her work and loves the people she serves. The repetition of these images in the media and other venues normalized the vision of black women and this work. Black women were suitable for domestic work and should not have higher aspirations. Media images of happy domestics masked the reality of black women's work, casting them as content and joyous. They were routinely shown as individuals with limited abilities, as people who could not chart their own course, and who accepted their fate as people who labored to care for members of the white race. Such images obscure the reality of the work for these women and their own interpretations of their experiences. We do not see how women were pushed into this work as daughters, sisters, wives, and mothers because of the failure of patriarchy to extend to the black community. We do not see how they're exploited, forced to work hard, given questionable lodging, and subject to sexual harassment. It would take scholarship to expose the complexities of the work role and what it meant for black women to be domestics, since Hollywood only gave us the happy maid. The dominance of the domestic image in film also makes invisible the other work that black women did in their communities and the wider society. In the 1930s and 40s, we do not see teachers, clerical workers, or black women doing other work on the big screen. Their marginal position in the larger treatment, which is basically a white story, also fails to show black women domestics in any other roles. Sisters, daughters, friends, wives, mothers, grandmothers, community leaders, church members, consumers, and citizens. Instead, they are just servants. Furthermore, these celluloid images also do not help us understand the meaning of domestic work for the women, for their families, as they may be major breadwinners and important community builders. Film images can normalize a group's circumstances. Stereotypic images can justify new discrimination. The research I did on black women who graduated from predominantly white colleges between 1968 and 1970, I found that growing up as a baby boomer in the 1950s and 1960s, many of the raised working class black women I interviewed talked about how they had to fight to get into college preparatory programs because teachers saw them as future domestic workers and wanted to channel them into home economics tracks. They had parents who pushed for their rights, but we do not know how many young black women were steered away from academic pursuits. So these images are indeed very important. This framing of black women's experiences are very important in the past as well as in the present. It would take scholars who had worked to develop new frames. And one of the amazingly important areas in history as well as social science is reframing domestic work that challenged these old media images. And the list of people is just too long. I mean, it begins with Angela Davis and Deborah Gray White and David Katzman and Tara Hunter, Elizabeth Clark Lewis, Bonnie Thornton Dill, Carol Marks, Judith Rollins, many sociologists and historians. This work provides a reframing for thinking about the work, about the women who were private household workers. They're not the media images that people were bombarded with during the time when it was the most common occupation of African American women. Finding the voices of women who did this work, we see it was hard, degrading, paid low wages, and women were subject to sexual assaults. They operated within a wider context where they were partially disenfranchised and economically exploited. Rather than being people with limited abilities, women did this work because they were routinely denied access to other work, even when qualified. Their dominance within this occupation is evidence of the power of limited access to work by ideologies and inferiority accompanied with a denial of political and economic rights. Scholars have reclaimed the voices of the women to share with us the ways in which they resisted working conditions and limited ideas about them. Most important, we have learned how they used the work to support themselves and families. They saved their earnings to move out of employers' homes, where they were often on call 24/7 and vulnerable to sexual exploitation. Their earnings enabled them to set barriers between work and their personal lives, to build institutions, join and support churches and other organizations that promoted their growth. And many used their work sites to learn about the larger community and develop skills in navigating mainstream society. In the face of no research, the lives of Black American women doing domestic work was defined by people outside of their communities and used to justify their exploitation. So scholars in the humanities and social science reframe their efforts so that we could understand the nature of economic and political exploitation they faced, and not just the scars of these experiences, but the resistance and creative ways they moved forward in their own lives to build communities. And these communities are decidedly missing in the movies. Today we have Black women working in a range of different occupations, but we also have to think about the lessons we learn here in terms of thinking about current workplace issues for Black women. As a sociologist, much like the people in political science, there's a way in which the quantitative really drives much of what goes on in the field. And the numbers are important, but we can't let numbers in terms of demographic trends limit our analysis. Such presentations can mask race and sex-segregated patterns of employment that reflect labor cues, that is, preferences of employers for establishing and maintaining racial and gender hierarchies in the workplace. To address these concerns, we have to get beyond occupational categories and really take work seriously. What is the work? Where is it done? What are the social relations on the job? What is the compensation for this work? Does this occupation change with the arrival of significant numbers of Black women? As workplaces desegregate, do they retain measures of racial and gender bias, or are these environments that operate as meritocracies? If workplaces are problematic, how do Black women face these new challenges? These are important questions that we have to consider as we do research on the work that black women do. Just as domestic work was identified with black women for decades, other occupations might be connected to specific race and gender groups. New entrants into an occupation are often described with an adjective: a woman lawyer, a black doctor, a male secretary. For women of color, the adjective is frequently preceded by an adverb, such as the black woman professor, the Latina woman professor. As black women enter new fields and workspaces, what is the reception to them, and what are their perceptions of the status? Today, we have increasing numbers of black women in sales and office occupations. Do we find black women in clerical positions sitting in nice offices with windows, or are they in the typing pool and word processing stations? As they enter sales positions, are they working behind the counters or on the floors of fine department stores, or are they in large retail chains? Positions with similar occupational categories, sales and office occupations, but can have very different workplaces that are linked to status, pay, and perhaps even job satisfaction. What does work in this occupation represent for black women, given their level of educational attainment, traditional human capital variables, as well as expectations, roles, and obligations? I say this, it's important that we look at workplace issues and also sort of get us beyond these categories, because the spaces where employees of various positions come together can be linked to specific race gender groups. Employers have used established hierarchies as a mean of maintaining control over workers, but these workers have also become invested in their places in terms of the racial and gender order. Such practices used to mean operating all white establishments, excluding people of color who were devalued, and that enhanced the esteem of workers, often white immigrants, who could pass for white. It is also common to have clear racial markers in workspaces, where white people are in the front office and people of color are in the back rooms or in stock rooms. As employees are pushed to change practices and hire people of color, they can still desegregate selectively. We have cases where large retail chains only place black managers in stores in minority communities. Civil Rights Act and other litigation have resulted in progress, but a celebration of the end of blanket exclusion should be cautious. Scholars have to turn attention to a complexity of patterns of selective inclusion in workplaces of various sizes. If we shape our studies to address these issues, we find racism and sexism expressed in where black women work, the conditions they face in the workplace, as well as factors of pay and benefits. I say this because work is, according to Karl Marx, an intrinsic need. And if we see these critical human activities and recognize them as such, not just sort of categories, we can ask, do these critical human activities that carry intrinsic and extrinsic rewards, they can be sources of satisfaction or alienation. Working can bring us into contact with others in various ways that can either enrich or degrade our lives, or push us to develop coping mechanisms that can be stressful. Investigations also have to look at black women's work in a changing workplace within the context of emerging technologies, economic developments, political and social rights, and human choices. Therefore, just as people made a way out of no way in domestic work in much of the 19th and 20th century, as we begin to see the 21st century, we can see how black women face employment challenges, but with different sets of tools, including more social rights. Thank you very much.